Let me introduce our speaker this morning. It's Michael Lee Stallard. Michael is president of leadership training in a coaching firm called Pluribus Partners. He co-founded it in 2002. He speaks, teaches, and coaches to all kinds of organizations to boost productivity, innovation, and organizational performance. He's worked with all kinds of organizations: GE, Google, Johnson & Johnson, NASA, Lockheed Martin, even the government, U.S. Treasury Department. Prior to founding Pluribus Partners, Michael was Chief Marketing Officer for the private wealth management businesses of Morgan Stanley and Charles Schwab. Earlier in his career, he's worked in investment banking at Barclays and marketing and financial management positions at Texas Instruments. He's also the primary author of the best-selling book, Fired Up or Burned Out: How to Reignite Your Team's Passion, Creativity, and Productivity. And he must be a good dad because his daughter, Sarah, even got up early to come see his dad. So, Michael, good to have you. Michael Lee Stallard. You know, at the Neely School, we talk about our mission is to prepare ethical leaders with a global perspective who help shape the business environment. And in your book, you talk about how organizations can really gain competitive advantage by improving their employee engagement. So what's that all about? Why is employee engagement so important, and what's that about?
Yeah, let me just explain the concept of employee engagement. You know, there's the term employee satisfaction has been out there for a lot of years. And satisfaction is really not a good measure of the effort that employees put in their business. Employee engagement not only picks up the concept of satisfaction, but also enthusiasm, how people feel about the business they're in, and whether or not that transfers into actionable behavior. So it's not just not just satisfaction, but it's actually are they giving their best efforts? Are they aligning their behavior with the organization's goals? And this is really relevant to leaders of any group. You know, if you're a leader of a rock band or a leader of a nation, you want the people you're leading to be engaged so that they give their best efforts and align their behavior with your goals as a leader. And what we see from research, Homer, is that, and there are a lot of organizations who have done this research, but in America, 75% of the employees are not engaged in their jobs. So that's over 101 million individuals who are not achieving anywhere near their potential. So just think of the potential increase in productivity and innovation if we can connect with those individuals and get them to participate in thinking about how to improve the organization, to give their best efforts, to have a positive impact on the people we're working with. So there's tremendous opportunity for leaders to boost engagement and boost productivity of their organizations.
Okay, so is it about emotions? Is it about connections? What's the basis for it?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. That what we've learned from research, and I think the great leaders know this from their experience, is that you connect with people in two ways. There's a rational connection that's about, do we understand our jobs, what our responsibilities are, what's expected of us. So you have to connect in that way, obviously. But it's also important to connect emotionally, because what we've learned is that emotional connections are 4 times as important as rational connections when it comes to the amount of effort that people put into their work. So emotional connections include, how do people feel about their supervisor? Do they feel a sense of connection with the supervisor? How do they feel about the people they work with? How do they feel about the business's mission, its values, how they go about accomplishing what they're doing, their core values? How do they feel about the business's reputation? So there are all these different ways that people have an emotional connection or not to the business. And these emotional connections are really critical. So that's what I've been doing since 2002, is looking in different contexts to understand how great leaders, and also leaders throughout history, how leaders have emotionally connected with the people they're leading to produce outstanding results for a long period of time. So that includes leaders like George Washington. How did a military commander lead 13 independent militias to defeat the greatest military power in their age? How did that happen? Or how did a young queen in England who inherited the throne in the 1500s at a time when women were not respected, How did Queen Elizabeth transform her nation? And also their treasury was practically empty when she became queen. How did she lead England through the period that historians call the Golden Age to become one of the greatest powers in the world? How did that happen? So I actually worked with historians, and there are 20 stories in the book that show through the lens of connection how some of these great leaders through history, leaders of nations, leaders of sports teams, leaders of business organizations, leaders of social sector organizations, how did they connect to produce outstanding results over time?
So when you're talking about leading, how do you get space to lead in your life? You know, leaders of any kind, whether it's a military leader or a corporate leader, you're busy all the time. You know, people out here are busy all the time. How do you get time to step back? And what does it take to do that? To really...
That's a great question. I think, you know, the way we like to frame it in our research when we're teaching organizations is to think of it this way, that we reduce it down to a formula. It's maybe a little overly simplistic, but there's a lot of truth in it. And the formula is this, that leaders need to be intentional about achieving task excellence, number one, but they also need to be intentional about achieving relationship excellence by creating a culture of connection. And when they achieve task excellence and relationship excellence, it produces sustainable superior performance. So in order to manage that, it requires some wisdom about how to allocate your time. It requires hiring good people who can take over some of the task management things. It also requires leaders to become comfortable learning how to connect. And I was speaking at Lockheed Martin Aerospace, and the former commander of the 5th Fleet, who I believe lives here in the Fort Worth area, Admiral Willie Moore is his name, and Admiral Moore came up to me afterward and said, I want to introduce you to the former Chief of the Navy, because he did what you're talking about, and we saw the impact it had on the U.S. Navy. So he introduced me to Admiral Vern Clark, who was the Chief of the Navy from 2000 to 2005, and Admiral Clark, I learned, was a lifelong student of leadership. And he really was very reflective about what it was required to be a great leader. And that's a whole story maybe I should or shouldn't go into. But I found that he had been a student of leadership. And he was great at delegating the things that he could delegate and understanding that it was important for him to lead the people, not just with his authority, but with his presence and to mentor the leaders who reported to him so that they would follow his behavior.
Sarah, I get to embarrass you here. There's this rock band called U2. Do you know about that band? No. Tell us about that. You worked with that group.
Sure.
That's
well,
pretty,
I've studied them.
cool.
I've studied them. Yeah, I find this was a really interesting case. If you go back, like I said, what we call the connection edge or a connection culture applies to any group. It applies to, I want to say this too, because it's important for you to understand this. What we're talking about, it not only applies to your life at work, it applies to your life with your family and with your friends. If you are not intentional about cultivating, what I call the force of connection in your life, I guarantee you that you will look back on your life with regret. And because we see a lot of people in their middle years or later years in life where they didn't maintain that connection with their spouse, with their children. In some cases, their spouse or children don't want anything to do with them because they didn't maintain that emotional connection. It's interesting that the number one factor that's been shown to help marriages endure is whether or not the couple feels a sense of emotional attachment. They can fight, they can have disagreements, but if they still maintain that sense of emotional connection, the marriage endures. Well, those same emotions spill over into the workplace. So anyway, let me tell you the U2 story. U2 was founded in 1974 by a 14-year-old drummer named Larry Mullen Jr. At Mount Temple School in Dublin, Ireland. He posted a notice on the board that said, drummer starting a band. Interested parties call this number. And several people showed up at Larry's kitchen, and they started practicing together. In their early gigs, their timing was so poor, especially the bass player who had a bass guitar but had never really studied playing the bass guitar, that their audiences booed. They were that bad. And the bands who followed them sometimes just laughed in their face. They were atrocious. They had a lot of energy. The lead singer, Bono, tended to scream more than sing. And from those very shaky beginnings, these guys had a commitment to one another that developed, that strengthened over time. And if you fast forward almost 40 years later, they have now won more Grammy Awards than any band in history. More than the Beatles, more than the Rolling Stones. And in fact, I'll predict that by the time they finish their careers, probably in all of our lives here, we will not see another band that will support. They will be the UCLA men's basketball team in terms of what they achieve. Maybe our children will, in their lifetimes, they might see another band that achieves more than U2. They've just been phenomenally successful. So I actually had a friend of ours who is a drummer on Broadway came up to me and said, I think you should take a look at the rock band U2 because they do some things you're talking about. So I started studying it. I posted some things in my blog. I got emails from all around the world, all these people who follow U2 who said, take a look at this article, or they would send me links to articles, or look at this book. And so when I studied the story, I found out that they do three things. We reduce this force of connection down to a simple formula to make it memorable, and it's just vision plus value plus voice equals connection. And the vision of the rock band U2, without getting into definitions, because I think this will give you a good idea of what we're talking about. The vision of U2 is, Bono calls it the spark, or sometimes he calls it, we've got it. And that's what makes us different from so many bands. We're musicians and we're entertainers, but we are so much more than that. Because our music is about faith, it's about human rights and social justice in the world. And we're, in a sense, traveling salesmen who are conveying our ideas and our beliefs through our music. So that is one reason that they've come together around those ideas that they have a passion for, especially Bono and really, I think all the band members now, maybe not to the degree that the lead singer does. But that helps unite them because they have those shared values and mission. Secondly, they value one another. And that's really interesting. One of the things I learned about the band was they split the economic profits 5 equal ways, which really surprises people when they look at Bono, who's the megastar. You would think maybe he's taking half the profits. No, he's taking 20%. And it's split with the other 3 band members, and their long-term manager gets a 20% cut of the economic profits. Now, that's one way that helps bring them together. Bono gets so much attention. He's always trying to shine the light on his other band members. He's giving them recognition. So, for example, he says, I've heard him say in interviews that I'm a lousy guitar player. I'm a lousy keyboards player. But because I have these talented musicians, Edge, the lead guitar player, Larry Mullen Jr., the drummer, the bass player, Adam Clayton, they help me bring the music that I hear in my head to life. So he is always trying to give them recognition, and that makes them feel connected to him. It boosts their confidence and sense of attachment to him as their leader. Another thing that's been especially powerful about their history as a band is they have had each other's backs in life from early on. And to understand that story, you have to go back to the time when Bono was 14 years old. When he was 14 years old, his mother passed away. She had attended her father's funeral, and she had a brain hemorrhage and died. Bono said that was a time when their home became a house because his father was so all 3, his brother and his father, they were all grief-stricken over the loss of the lovely Iris, as Bono calls her. And so Bono grieved alone. He really didn't have anyone to help him through that time. So he went through a period of suffering as a 14-year-old boy. And then a year after the band started, Larry Mullen Jr., the drummer, his mother passed away, and in an automobile accident. And Bono reached out to him and said, I know what you're going through. I've been there, and I'm going to be there for you. And he just helped this young friend of his get through a very tough season in life, that we all experience tough seasons. Whether it's health of a loved one, our own health, death of a loved one, loss of job, all kinds of things we experience where we need other people to help us, who have our back, who help us get through life. And so it developed this connection, this friendship between the two. And then years later, when Edge, the lead guitar player, when he went through a tough divorce, the guys were there to help him get through that because he struggled during that period. And then Adam Clayton, the bass player, who was always a pretty big partier, I think. He was dating some high-profile models, and he actually developed an alcohol addiction and maybe partial drug addiction as well. And he actually came to one concert. He was so wasted that he was unable to play. And so they had someone, a roadie who knew his part, who stepped in and played the bass guitar through the concert that was actually being filmed. So these guys had an important decision to make. Do we cut this guy loose now? He let us hang out to dry. And these guys all have a passion for excellence, so it was a big, big thing for him to show up and not be able to play. And they adopted the motto that we're all going to get through this alive, that we're going to put our relationships and helping each other through life ahead of our music. And so they helped him over a 5-year period overcome this drug addiction. And then on another occasion, Bono, the band was playing in Arizona, a concert, and they received a death threat that said it was aimed at Bono. And it said, if you play the song Pride, which is called In the Name of Love, some of you probably know that song, and it's about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It said, if you play that song, I'll blow your effing head off. And the FBI told the band that they believed it was not a hoax, and they needed to take the threat seriously. So they decided they were going to play the song anyway, and they went on stage, they played it. Bono closed his eyes as he was singing the lyrics of the song. And at the end of a verse, he opened his eyes. To his surprise, Adam Clayton, the bass player who had the drug and alcohol addiction, was literally standing in front of him to shield his friend from harm.
Wow.
Now, do you think you feel a sense of connection to a friend who does something like that? When the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Bono thanked Adam for being willing to take a bullet for him. And some people laughed, but he was serious. Now, it's just, that's some of the things they do. I'm not saying you have to take a bullet for a colleague at work, but maybe metaphorically at times, to stick up for someone who it's just right to stick up for them and defend them. Those situations happen. And in a sense, that's taking a bullet, too, when you have the courage to stand up for something that's right that may be dangerous to do in terms of job security or promotability. So I just found their story is, they've been so successful, and when you read their story, they attribute it to some of those things that they have that connection. The other thing I didn't mention is the third element. So I've talked about vision, value, and the last one is voice, which is real. There's so many opportunities, I think, for companies to improve in this area. And the way they make decisions is they don't go forward on a particular decision if one member of the band strongly disagrees with a particular decision. So in a sense, they have veto authority. Now, you couldn't give veto authority to all employees, obviously. But I think it just gives them a voice, and that's the important. Mm-hmm. You can't you can give people a voice. You can't give them a vote all the time. Maybe sometime you can, but giving them a voice, keeping them informed, making sure that you're soliciting their opinions and ideas and considering them and implementing the good ones. It's very, very powerful in terms of making people feel emotionally committed to the business so that they want to give their best efforts and align their behavior with organizational goals. I'm talking too much.
No, that's good. That's very interesting. Those of us that went to the Rose Bowl, there was something that happened I think at the first of the game, right before the game started, which I think speaks to what you were saying. Each team had a player welcome everyone to the Rose Bowl. I don't know if you remember that, the very first. And the player that we had was John Woolridge, Jr. John I think he's a sophomore lineman for us who hadn't played very much this year. He did play, but not very much. He wasn't one of the All-American linemen yet. He will be. But he was the one that gave the welcome on the big screen at the Rose Bowl for TCU. I don't know how many of you noticed that, but I was actually touched by that because it said something to me about Gary Patterson's approach to football, to his organization, that he gave voice to everyone on the team, and it was about the kind of things that you were talking about, I think, around that. Yeah. Let me ask you about Steve Jobs, a little bit. He's going through some challenges now. So I know you've worked and studied them a bit. So there's kind of two elements. Kind of what did you learn from him and what he's done at Apple? And then as a leader, when you're going through challenges, what's that going to mean to you and to the organization?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. We could spend the whole time on that probably.
Yeah.
Well, just to give, for those of you who may not know Apple's story and Jobs' story, well, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple. They started it in a garage in California, and it grew. They eventually took the company public, and the directors decided it was time to make a leadership change. So they went about replacing Jobs, and he got huffy and decided to leave, and he founded his next company, which he called Next. And then Apple brought in an outside CEO who was supposed to take them to the next level, and it never happened. So eventually, Apple bought Next, and they brought Jobs back in as CEO. And what he learned when he came back into Apple was that Apple had lost its way, that people forgot their identity, who they were, and who he envisioned, also how Steve Jobs thinks of himself as an innovator. What he learned was people were starting to think of themselves as just technologists, as technology people who were building computers for the most part. And he saw them as so much more. And so what he did is he teamed up with an advertising agency. They created the campaign Think Different. And the whole gist of that advertising campaign was that Apple is not, they're not just technologists, they're innovators, because they have these easy-to-use graphical user interfaces. It makes the computer more accessible. And this is back in the day of some of the old IBM-based, Windows-based systems that were a little harder to use. And for an engineer, it wasn't a problem. But for those of us who are not engineers, it wasn't so easy. So they used this graphical user interface to create the Mac. And Jobs' argument was that we are changing the world. We're making the power of a computer available to people who may feel intimidated by technology. It could be writers, we can imagine the people who were not comfortable. I know it really helped me become more comfortable with computers using Apples. And so his argument was that we were changing the world. And so in their advertising, they showed images. You didn't see any computers, which was interesting back then. It was images of people who had changed the world. And when they rolled out that first, I wish we could show the clip today, but when they rolled out the first ad of that campaign at Apple, there was a writer in the audience who was watching Steve Jobs, and it said, when they played that first ad, there were tears streaming down Jobs' face. And he was so moved for a few seconds, he wasn't able to speak. It just really connected with him. Well, all I can say is, I hope you bought the stock at that point in time, because that was an inflection point in Apple's history. And they had some bumps going up the road, but wow, incredible wealth creation worldwide with the growth of their computers. And now they're the most respected company in America, wildly successful. So Homer, your other question about just the health struggles and
what happens when the leader all of a sudden is the one that needs the caring?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. You hope that, I think of Manfred Ketz de Vries. I don't know if you know him. He was a professor at NCED. He's done some work studying CEOs and investment bankers. And one of the things he concluded was that healthy CEOs who are successful for a long period of time, the thing that distinguishes them from the CEOs who don't have sustainable success is they have healthy relationships in the workplace and in life. And, when things are going great in a company and you're firing on all cylinders and the wind is behind your back, these things we're talking about, connection, are, quite honestly, they're not as important. They can still help you perform better, but the time that connection is really critical in an organization is when you're facing headwinds. When people have to pull together, when maybe some person has a serious illness like Steve Jobs. You need people who will step in and help you get your job done. You need people who will not be pointing fingers, but will collaborate, will trust one another, and do the work that needs to be done to keep the group performing at a high level of task excellence. Yeah, so those relationships are really critical.
Tell me about, does it matter whether leadership comes from the top of the organization, the middle of the organization, the bottom? Where does it fit?
You know, that's a great question, too, because I get that question all the time. People ask, doesn't this have to start at the top of the organization? And no question, that's ideal, right? If you have the leader at the top, like Admiral Clark, when Admiral Clark came in, the Navy's first-term reenlistment was under 38%. This was in 2000, you know, after the tailhook scandal in the Navy, after the former chief of the Navy had committed suicide, Jeremy Borda. So the Navy's spirits were really down. Admiral Clark came in and he brought pride back to the Navy. There are a whole bunch of things he did we can go into. But we saw in 18 months, the Navy's first-term reenlistment went from under 38% to 56.7%. Huge impact on the Navy. And so it's, and I'm sorry, I'm losing track now of my...
in terms of where the leadership comes from, top of the organization or wherever?
Well, yeah, you know, obviously it's great if you get leaders at the top. But you know what research shows is that in every organization, there is a dispersion of connection. And what that tells us is that it's not intentionally managed. That most organizations don't have employee engagement surveys so that they can help the managers who need help creating a high sense of connection and morale in the organization. And so you'll go into organizations and you'll find a work group that's working together that's really fired up and they're giving their best effort. Their behavior's aligned. They're working well as a team. They're very productive. And you may go down the hall and find another group where the morale in the group it's basically a culture that's draining the life out of the people who are in that group. So, and you find that in every organization. Mm-hmm. So I think what that tells us is that it really can, every single work group can have a high degree of connection and productivity. What matters more is the work group matters more than the leader at the top of the organization. Like I said, it's ideal to have the leader at the top. Mm-hmm. But most important is what happens in the work group, the people you work with on a day-to-day basis.
Before we open it, one more question, we're going to open it to the audience for questions. A lot of students here. Thank you for getting up early. I know it's a noble thing to do as a college student. When you think about their lives that they're going to be facing in a couple of years, burned out means a lot. Mm-hmm. Some of the students that are going to be working in the workforce are going to have long, long hours. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does that fit for them? I mean, what do you have advice for them as they get ready to face 65-hour weeks and you know, what happens? Yeah.
Well, I do have advice for them. I would say, you know, it's important for you to learn what fires up people. It's important to you. It's really learning about human nature. And if you learn these things about vision, about value, about voice, then you can be more intentional in bringing that to the culture you're in. Because I think that's in the earlier question that I answered, that local is more important, you know, at the bottom of the organization is more important, the work group, than the very top. Mm-hmm. You as an individual coming into a work group you will, if you're intentional about it, you will have an impact on improving the culture of the work group. Mm-hmm. So if you learn these things, number one, it's good to have realistic expectations and know that sometimes you may be getting into situations where it's not the best culture. But if you're in an organization you like, I would encourage you, if you feel like it's not the best work group you're in, look at moving to a different group within the corporation. I did that early in my career in Texas Instruments, and I found that I learned more from moving laterally, and I was able to work myself into a work group that really fired me up. So that's one way to think about it. But learning those things that bring vision, value, and voice and fire up people, you can contribute that to the culture that you're working in, and that'll help you get ahead in your career too. Mm-hmm. But it also helps in your life outside of work.
Let's open it to the audience. And any questions you have? Challenges you face as leaders or others? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about Obama's leadership approach and any advice you might give him?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a hot one.
And did it matter?
The seat's warming up.
And did it matter that the Congress and senators sat together last night?
Yeah.
The parties. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's always hard to tell from afar. I think if you look at President Obama from a distance, which I don't know him. I know one person who's in the Obama administration. I don't know him well, former military guy. And when you look at a distance, I think he's good at connecting with foreign leaders, certainly making an effort to connect across the political aisle. What's always tough and what's really important is what goes on behind closed doors. Does he have the humility to genuinely seek and consider the opinions of the other party? What are those discussions that go on behind closed doors? And I don't know the answer to that. I think what we see on the outside are some good signs about President Obama in terms of how he connects with leaders of other nations and what he's doing with the other party. But like I said, what's really important is what's going on behind closed doors. Does he have that humility is so important, because that's what, if you have the humility to know that you don't have all the answers, that nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, then you genuinely seek and consider the ideas of others, and that's how you really pull people together. So, I don't know the answer to that question, but those are the things I would be thinking about. What's going on behind closed doors?
Isn't that, for all of us that are in leadership roles, it's a lot of times you say there's a leadership formula. You have a formula, and obviously a lot of people have different approaches with that. Organizations are so complex, and the president's job is just, I don't know how you can begin to put your arms around it. But any organization, when you have hundreds of people that are working for you, there's such a degree of complexity. Can leadership be oversimplified?
Well, it goes both ways, I think. You have to come up with some general principles, because it can be overwhelming in its complexity. Yeah. And there is, I think, the connection formula, task excellence plus relationship excellence equals sustainable superior performance, and relationship excellence is connection or vision, value, voice. I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's not perfect, obviously, but it helps managers manage the complexity and really get their arms around, how do I create a culture that will motivate people to give their best efforts and align their behavior with organizational goals? So there's always trade-offs.
Sure.
But after years of research, we came up with that formula. We've had a lot of affirmation. I remember even Admiral Clark called me from Atlanta one time. He had spoken at a leadership conference and said, I want to encourage you to keep writing and speaking, because what you're talking about, so few leaders understand how critical that is to leadership. And he told me that he was talking about my book when he was speaking at conferences. So I've had a lot of affirmation from leaders to say, this really has helped me get my arms around, how do I motivate my people that I'm responsible for leading?
I know for me, I like to say, as a dean, I just try to have a little vision, try to inspire, and I pray a whole lot.
That's humility too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hope you were pointing at me. Something that has stymied me for a long time. It's a concept that I think is the root cause of a lot of problems within an organization, but I don't know what to do about it. And I was wondering if you had some insight on it. And it's the conflict between self-interest and company interest.
Yeah.
It seems to be everywhere from all levels, and it seems like a definite root cause, but what do you do about it?
Right. And we're self-interested as human beings. So that is a great question, by the way. Thank you for bringing that up. Because I think one aspect of this connection, when these connections exist, when people feel connected to a cause greater than self, that's actually a phrase that Admiral Clark uses, a cause greater than self. That's when they start to surrender the me for the we. So that's why these elements of connection are so critical, because if you don't connect with people, they don't transcend self-interest to think about the interest of the group. And they don't take the risk. What we see is when people don't feel, let me phrase this in a positive way. When people feel connected, as I said earlier, they give their best efforts, they align their behavior with organizational goals, but they also do something else that's very important. They are more collaborative to help the people around them. If they find out information, what happens if in organizations that are disconnected is knowledge traps develop. So that there may be information that an employee has that goes against the views of a leader or the general views of the organization, and if they're just showing up for the paycheck and they don't feel connected and have their hearts in their work and have the best interest of the organization in mind, will they take the risk to share that information with the group, knowing that the group probably does not want to hear it? No, they will not. And there's a lot of evidence at NASA that there was information in NASA that engineers had that they didn't feel safe sharing with the broader group, and it led to management failure and 2 space shuttle disasters. So it's really critical to get those connections right so that people will surrender, they'll surrender the me for the we, or move from self-interest to group interest. So that's a great, great question.
Yes.
Excuse me. We gave some examples that were international, but I just wonder if, as we try to think globally and teach our students to think globally, are there certain elements that come into play in a little bit different way when you're thinking about leadership in a global context?
Yeah, I think you have to understand the culture. And what I have found is that this concept of connection, it really is a universal culture. Because I remember I was speaking at Johnson & Johnson, and it was the Vision Care group, and at the end of my presentation, the woman who headed human resources stood up and she said, "I want to thank you for sharing this idea of connection, because we have an employee engagement program, and a lot of you have seen the issues that are going on with Johnson & Johnson in the press these days. They know employee engagement is an important issue there that they need to improve." And she was trying to get the Japanese people she was responsible for leading and the leaders she worked with to promote employee engagement. And it was a concept that wasn't resonating with people in Japan. And so she came up and she said, "I want to thank you because this concept of connection, of feeling connected, resonates." Then she walked up to a whiteboard and she wrote a word in kanji. And then she deconstructed it. She kind of divided it up. And she said, "This means to feel as one body of people." It's like the French term, esprit de corps. We have a sense of, we feel like one body. We are in this together. And we feel it. And so this, this concept of connection really is a global, it's part of human nature. And when people feel connected, and we know this from research too, that was an interesting part of our research. We saw that, not only in organizational behavior research, you see that organizations where employees feel connected are 20% more productive than the average employee. So in other words, they get an extra day of productivity a week when employees feel connected to the business and their leaders and the people they work with. And we know from neuroscience that when people feel connected, it boosts dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. These are hormones and neurotransmitters that make people feel more energetic, more confident, and also more trusting of the people around them. But at the same time, it's interesting that when people feel connected, it reduces the stress hormones in their brains, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine decline. So the effect of that is, when you're under a lot of stress, if you don't feel relationally connected in the workplace, your brain activity shifts to the midbrain, where you're more likely to make a rash decision than a rational decision. But if you feel supported, you're in a safe environment where you're going through a difficult business environment together, and you feel connected, the brain activity stays in the front of the brain, where we make more rational decisions. So we really see, the research is amazing to show how connection really affects us all our life. Babies who don't feel connected, or babies who feel connected because they are held and interacted with by their caregivers, those babies go on to have a mental and physical health advantage that lasts their entire lifetime. Students, elementary school students who feel connected, they perform better because their teachers make eye contact. This is very relevant here. Because their teachers make eye contact and provide kind of positive, affirming head nods and things like that. Those students perform better academically. Adolescents who feel connected are less likely to get in trouble. Adults who feel connected are more creative and better problem solvers. And Seniors who feel connected live longer. So this force of connection really helps us throughout our lifetime. So that's probably more answer than you wanted, that question.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Another question? Yes.
Hi, good morning. What do you do to promote connection and genuine engagement in companies where the results of engagement are tied into bonuses or incentives?
Yeah, where the results of engagement. Do you know a company where the result? I'd like to see compensate. You know, I think of Intuit. Intuit's an example where they have annual employee engagement surveys, and they consider that in in their strategic planning process. They're another company I had interacted with, some Avon Corporation. They're very intentional about measuring employee engagement, and they also come back and they give managers who are struggling in this area, or even if they're not, they give them 3 specific areas to focus on. So, I would like to see more companies do that. I would say most companies don't measure employee engagement at this point in time. So, getting them to that first step, just measuring it and considering the results is job one. And then I think also considering it in the compensation eventually makes a lot of sense. If managers are not able to engage their employees, then they don't really belong in a management position because they're not leaders. They may be leading from position, but they're not leading from influence, and that's what leadership is all about, when people want to follow you. Yes?
American Airlines, when they made a decision to expand their global service, turned to one of their employee resource groups, and they helped with the menu selections, making them feel engaged.
Yeah.
I believe their employee resource groups focusing on the LGBT community even went to Capitol Hill, assisting in legislation for that specific group. Do you find that kind of engagement throughout your research with other major companies? And I don't work for America.
Well, it was funny. I was flying this week, and I was reading the Hemispheres magazine about United Airlines, and they were talking about, one of the articles up front in that magazine is about they're giving their employees voice and soliciting, they're taking some of the practices that were in place at Continental and applying it to the new combined airline. So absolutely, giving employees a voice, it gives them a sense that they really can change, because what happens if employees don't have voice, if they don't feel informed, if they don't feel that they have an opportunity to share their opinions and ideas and that they're truly considered, they start to develop this psychological condition called learned helplessness that sets in kind of a sense of, it really drains optimism and enthusiasm out of them unless they feel they have some ability to make a positive contribution rather than just performing their specific tasks. It also engages them in thinking about how do we improve the business. And I think of Howard Behar, who's a friend of mine. He was the guys who kind of ran and built Starbucks, they called them H2O, Howard, and Orrin. And there's Howard Schultz, of course, who was the primary guy in the press. And there was Howard Behar. And Howard Behar was the guy who was president of Starbucks North America. And, I think it was in one of the group, I want to say Santa Monica, California. There was a local Starbucks out there, and they came up with an idea that they ran up through the marketing department that shot it down. It was a new drink idea. And, but they knew Howard was a safe guy, so they contacted Howard Behar and said, Howard, you've got to get down here and see what we're doing. Because they started running this little project on the side that the people at corporate didn't know about. And, they were making these new frozen drinks with coffee in them, and they were kind of sweet, and they were selling them. And they actually saw some competitors in the marketplace doing something similar. So Behar came down and saw it, and he said, okay, we have to get this in front of Howard Schultz and get it done. That's what they did. And today, the Frappuccino is a multi-billion-dollar business for Starbucks. And it was because those people in the store took the initiative. And that happens all the time. Oftentimes it's the employees who are on the front line of the business. If you don't tap into those ideas in an intentional way, then you are missing a lot of it. And that goes for cost reduction too, tapping into employees' ideas about how do we, we're going through tough times these days for a lot of us, and this may continue for a while. How do we reduce our costs? How do we get more efficient? Let's tap the corporate mind so that we get everybody's opinions and ideas and implement the best ideas. And boy, that fires up people.
There's something, at least my experience, is in Fort Worth, there's something about the business community here where I think I feel or experience a high level of that kind of engagement and connection. I think it's something that does characterize this community and the way people, and obviously it's always dangerous to signal out anyone, but I mean Frost Bank, that's part of their core, I think, of what they do. And so I think it's something very different that characterizes the way people approach business in Fort Worth with that. So
I believe that. I just the times I've been down here, and I was thrilled that Sarah became a student here at TCU, and part of that story is she's such a relational person. She really needed to be in a place where she would connect with her professors and with the community here. And we have just felt, because we're from Greenwich, Connecticut, about half an hour from New York City, and just the times I've been down here, there is people are so friendly, they're so helpful. You sense that on campus, you sense that in the Fort Worth community, and that culture of civility, Sarah was saying how much she enjoyed having men open doors for her, and guys, that doesn't always happen. Doesn't always happen in New York City, and but that really does make a difference. And that's. Let me just throw this out too, because I think some of you know this story. As I was doing the research on this, I had a personal experience that just brought this to life for me in a way that seeing the research and my past experiences in my career could not. And this was in 2003. My wife, Katie, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And in 2004, about a year later, she was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. And today, Katie, earlier this year, just celebrated her 7th year of being, now she's cancer-free. And thanks. But let me just share, I don't know how we are in time. Let me just share a little bit, because this was very powerful in my life and helping me see. Sorry, I'm going to get choked up. When our first, number one, it was the most frightening day of my life, was January 7th, 2004, when Katie was having surgery, and the surgery went on for 3 hours, and I started to have a panic attack. I'd never felt anything like that. But I started having trouble breathing, and eventually the surgeon came out into the lounge that we were waiting in, and he told me that Katie had cancer and it had spread some, and that he was sorry to have to share that with me. And that night I remember taking the girls home, and Sarah had actually fainted in the ICU after she saw her mom. And wow. Those memories, you see those pictures, and it kind of breaks your heart as a father and as a parent. I bet a lot of you know what that's like. And we got home, and I remember finding the girls later that night had snuggled up and fell asleep together. I have Sarah and Elizabeth was 10 at the time. Sarah was 12. And the two girls had fallen asleep on their mom's pillow. And, I remember praying, God, help me. I do not know what to do. And, heal Katie, give me the wisdom to know how to help Katie and how to help these little girls, because I don't know, and for the first time in my life, I felt powerless. And the next morning, I went to the hospital. I dropped the girls off at school, and I went to the hospital, and my business partner, Jason Pancod. Now, Jason is a pastor, and he's a 275-pound former All-American middle linebacker and captain of the Brown. He's a very intense guy. And I went to the hospital, and I walked into Katie's room. Her mom had spent the night with her. And, Jason was there when I got to the hospital. And I was surprised that someone beat me to the hospital, and I was also encouraged that this friend had rushed to our aid. And over that season, we had a huge outpouring of support from our friends, from our family. We had women in the community who organized meals for our family when Katie was so sick she couldn't get out of bed. They organized transportation for our girls to and from their after-school activities. One woman in town offered to do our laundry. I'd never seen anything. I felt like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, really. I was so encouraged by that, and it made me I just felt the emotional uplift by being supported by family and friends. And I remember at Sloan Kettering, our first visit when we went to Sloan Kettering in Midtown Manhattan, Katie and I were walking down the street. It's Midtown Manhattan, 53rd Street. We're getting close to the entrance of Sloan Kettering, and there's a big doorman, dark complexion, blue eyes. He locks his eyes on my wife and is greeting her like a returning friend. When she gets within eyesight of the place, and I realized the guy could recognize people who were wearing wigs, who were patients, cancer patients. And I thought, how wonderful that he is intentional about connecting with people he recognizes are coming to Sloan Kettering. And we entered in the reception area, and the receptionist was calling everybody honey. Now, this is highly unusual in Midtown Manhattan, that anybody is making eye contact in the street and people are calling you honey. And then the security people were friendly, the administrative people were friendly. We met with our oncologist, and she spent an hour with us. She educated us about the treatment options. She was upbeat and optimistic. And by the end of the day, I realized that I had two reactions. Number one, I had set my work aside to help Katie and the girls through this period, and I had done my research. I knew this was one of the best cancer teams in the world to treat ovarian cancer, because I'd done the research. I knew that. That was a very rational reaction. But I had a second reaction that day. I knew they cared because I could feel it. And you know what made me more optimistic? That maybe we could get Katie through that difficult season ahead. And that's what happened. And that's, I thought, here I am on the opposite side of the island of Manhattan for most of my experience on Wall Street. And it could have been the other side of the world because the culture was so different from most of what I experienced on Wall Street. And I thought, what if you had a culture where people felt that? I later learned that doorman was a cancer survivor. And he attributed his survival to the treatment he got at Sloan Kettering. Yeah. And when we shared with him that Katie was cancer-free, he gave her a big hug. Yeah. He told her how proud he was of her that she got through that. But it just shows, here's a guy who was acting kind of crazy on the streets of Manhattan, making eye contact with people. But he did it because he brought that passion to really, as a doorman, make a difference in the lives of patients and their families. Just think if all of our employees did that across America. It would be amazing what we would accomplish in terms of innovation and productivity. So there's a huge opportunity to really inspire people to give their best efforts and align their behavior together to accomplish great things.
Michael, we are all leaders, and whether it's at home, in organizations, in our companies,
That's so
and
true.
I think we'll all remember the visions and the values and the voice that we need to give to that. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Michael Lee Stallard.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.